Good morning. I guess since everybody got quiet, it's time for us to start. We're in the book of Hebrews this morning. We depends on how quickly I go through chapter 13. We may finish Hebrews today, or maybe next week that we finish Hebrews. But we've been studying in the book of Hebrews for a while now. We've been looking at the fact that Jesus is greater, that Jesus is better, and because Jesus is better and Jesus is greater, they need to hold on to their Christianity. They need to hold fast to their confession. They need to hold fast to their confidence. And so the Hebrews writer spends a lot of time on both of those subjects, that Jesus is better, and because he's better, you need to hold on to Christianity. The book's written to Jewish Christians who may, in order to escape persecution, want to go back into Judaism. And so it's written to them that everything that we have in Christ is better than what they had in Judaism. So why would you want to go back to that? Why would you want to go back to something that the Hebrews writer said is becoming obsolete, right, and is ready to vanish away in chapter 8 and verse 13? And so that's going to be taken out of the way. And we saw that sort of last week in Hebrews chapter 12, where we're at. We'll sort of pick up in verse 25, so we get back into the context of where we were. He says, "See that you do not refuse him who speaks, for if they did not escape, who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape, if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth, but now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven." Now this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. Verse 25 is a good verse to boil down everything that's in the book of Hebrews. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. You go back to the beginning of the book, right? God, who in various ways and various times and times past spoke to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, by whom he's appointed heir of all things. And so don't refuse him who is speaking. Don't refuse what it is that Jesus has to say. We have to give the more earnest heed to the things that we have heard, lest we drift away, he says in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1. And so the things that we've heard from Jesus, we've got to give more earnest heed to that than we do to the things that are in the Old Testament, the things that are in the Mosaic law, because that's the law that we're going to be judged by. That's what we have to answer to, right? That's our dispensation, if you will, or our covenant that he's made with us. And he spent some time in chapter 8 and following talking about that covenant, that new covenant. But we have a better covenant that's established under better promises. And so we need to make sure that we listen to him who speaks to us from heaven. If they did not escape, it says, who refused him who spoke on earth, when they didn't do what was in the Mosaic law, right? If the Mosaic law says, thou shalt not commit adultery, right? And they committed adultery, what would happen to them? They'd be punished, right? There was a punishment that would come. There was a just recompense or a just reward for their transgression. And so if they didn't escape when they transgressed, what's going to happen to us if we transgress, right? How shall we escape? The Hebrews writer says in chapter 2 and verse 3, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first was spoken to us by the Lord? And so don't refuse him who speaks. There's so much in this book that ties back into all the things that he's been telling us throughout this book, throughout this letter. And so how shall we escape, right, if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven? It says, whose voice shook the earth, right? We talked about at Mount Sinai how God's voice shook the earth, that there was smoke and fire and thundering and lightning, and the people were afraid when God spoke, and they told Moses, you go talk to God. Don't let God talk to us anymore because we're afraid, right? Moses even said that he was exceedingly afraid at that time. And so they were in fear, right? It was kind of a shock and awe thing. His voice shook the earth, but he says, now once more I'm going to shake the earth and heaven both, right? There's going to be another shaking that's going to happen. And sometimes folks look at this and they read this and they think this is talking about the end of the world. Because what's going to happen when Jesus comes back and time is no more? What's going to happen to this earth? It's going to be destroyed, right? It's going to burn. All the elements are going to burn with fervent heat. So it's going to be destroyed. So some folks read that and they think, well, this is talking about the end of the world. This shaken thing, right? Well, think about the context of the book. Think about the context of this sermon. He's been talking about the removal of Judaism, right? And the establishment of Christianity, and that you need to hold fast to Christianity. And so when he talks about, I'm going to shake things, this is why I think this book is written shortly before 70 AD. Because if it was written after 70 AD, in chapter 8, verse 13, these things wouldn't be becoming obsolete and ready to vanish away. They'd already be dead and buried, right? If the temple had already been destroyed by the Roman government and the empire, and the genealogical records had already been destroyed, there's no way that you can continue to practice Judaism. So what's he talking about? That he's going to shake and he's going to remove? Well, he's going to remove those things that are made by hands. And in the book, all the things that we've seen that are made by hands are in reference to the tabernacle, and in reference to the temple, and in reference to those earthly places under that first covenant, right? And so all of those things are being removed that are made with hands, so that that which cannot be shaken, well, what is it that cannot be shaken? What is it that's going to remain when Judaism's gone? The church, right? The church, or here he refers to it as the kingdom, right? He says, we are receiving, therefore, in verse 28, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, right? Which should take us back to Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. That Daniel had Daniel didn't have the dream. Nebuchadnezzar had the dream, but Daniel's explaining the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. His wise men couldn't tell him what the dream was, right? And maybe he's wise to his wise men that he doesn't want to tell them the dream, and then they're going to come up with some, cockamamie interpretation of what that was that may not be connected to anything. He says, no, you tell me what the dream was first. So Daniel receives this revelation from God. He's able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream is, and he tells him what the dream's about. And it's about 4 empires. It starts with Babylon as the head of gold, and then the Medes and the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then finally the Roman Empire. And in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44, he says, in the days of these kings, right, God's going to set up a kingdom which will never be shaken, right, which will never be destroyed. It's going to last forever. Because when time ends and Jesus comes back, he's going to deliver that kingdom up to the Father. That kingdom's not going to be destroyed, right? It's going to be given up to the Father when time ends, when Jesus returns. And so we're receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. So rather than all those old dead works of the Mosaic law, he says in verse 28, let us have grace, because it's the grace of God that we need in order to have salvation. Now, we need to be obedient. We need to receive that grace, but let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. We want to be able to serve God acceptably. And the word he uses there for service is a word that means priestly service. It's a word that we saw way back in chapter 1, where it talks about the angels are performing priestly service in chapter 1 and verse 7, and in chapter 1 and verse 14, where he talks about the angels ministering to those that will inherit salvation. He's talking about a priestly ministry. We're part of that priestly ministry. We're all now priests under the New Testament system, under the New Covenant, and we serve under our great high priest who is Jesus. And you spend a lot of time talking about Jesus as our high priest. Now, he's a better high priest than the human high priests. Because as Susan pointed out last week, he doesn't have to sacrifice for himself first. Right? Like those human high priests, they had to offer a sacrifice for their own sins and then for the sins of the nation. But he didn't need to do that, right? He ever lives, right? He has an unchangeable priesthood because he ever lives. And so we saw all of that in here. And so we are priests who serve under our high priest. And we can serve God acceptably, right? But to do that, we have to serve him with reverence and with godly fear. The word here for fear is not the one that we've seen often, which is phobos. It's a different word here. He's talking about we need to serve God with the right kind of reverence and notice awe, right? That God is awesome. And when we think about God at Mount Sinai, right, that was what they noticed, is that God, it was shock and awe, right? They saw how awesome God was. And so if we're going to serve God acceptably as priests under our high priest, then we've got to have reverence for God, we have to have respect for God, and we have to understand God's awesome power that he has. And so let us have grace so we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire, right? And when you think about that scene in Mount Sinai, right, the mountain was on fire. When you think about, well, who else can you think about that there was a consuming fire that when someone was serving God? Moses, there was a fire, right? The burning bush, then the bush wasn't consumed. That God is a consuming fire, but yet the bush wasn't consumed, and so it got Moses' attention. What happened with Elijah on Mount Carmel, right? He goes up there and there's, 450 false prophets that are up there, prophets of Baal or Baal, if you want to pronounce it that way, and Ashtaroth. And so there are all these false prophets that are there, and it's Elijah. He's one against, I think, 850. I think there's 850 on the other side. And so he poured a bunch of water on the sacrifice, but that didn't stop God, right? God's a consuming fire. The fire came down and it consumed the water, it consumed the sacrifice and it showed that he was really God, right? And so we think about that. Think about in Leviticus chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu decide that they're going to offer some strange fire to the Lord in the burning of incense, right? And what happened to them? Fire came out from, right? Our God is a consuming fire. God's awesome in his power, right? So we ought to have a little fear of what he can do to us, but we need to have reverence and respect and notice how awesome God is, because that keeps us humble. When we recognize that, it helps to keep us humble so that we don't get too big for our own britches and start thinking of ourselves we're too important and all of that. But the main body of the book of Hebrews is kind of done at this point. Is we have some maybe final announcements or some final admonitions. Assuming they're going to continue on in Christianity, he's going to give some final admonitions here and some directives in chapter 13. Kind of, here's how those who live by faith, here's how they live. Because he's been dealing with that passage from Habakkuk chapter 2, my just ones, my righteous ones shall live by faith, since the end of chapter 10. He shows us all those folks that live by faith in Hebrews chapter 11, shows us Jesus as the ultimate example of someone who lived by faith and didn't give up and endured until the end in chapter 12. And now he's going to say, here's what you need to do in order to be able to do the same things, to live by faith. Here's some directives for you. Any comments or questions through chapter 12? I love the book of Hebrews. That's why we've spent so much time, I guess, in it. It's hard for me to boil some of these things down or to cut them short or to summarize, because there's so much good material in this book, and it is so tight as far as how everything relates to what he's talking about through the whole book. A quiet group this morning. All right, if there's no comments or questions, I guess I explained that well. We'll go on to chapter 13. He says, let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. So in these first 4 verses, he starts off by saying, let brotherly love continue. We've got love for one another, right? We, as Christians, ought to have love for one another. He says, let that continue. Other places, the Bible tells us that folks that had love for one another, that they need to continue to grow in that, right? To continue, and we should never stop in our growth, right? We should never stop in growing closer to Christ, growing closer to the Lord, trying to become better Christians than we are today. We should always be wanting to strive to do better. And so he says, let brotherly love, right? Philadelphia, continue. I don't know if he's rooting for the Eagles tonight. The Hebrews writer may be, right? Because he wants Philadelphia to continue. I guess that would mean Kansas City would have to stop. But Philadelphia supposedly is the city of brotherly love. I don't show it so much. I think they threw snowballs at Santa Claus one time in Philadelphia at one of the football games years back. Was that? Threw batteries. Yeah, they threw batteries at folks. Sometimes they don't show a lot of brotherly love there, but that's how the city was named. So he says, let that continue. We need to continue to love one another. And not only one another inside, right? And not only just to us as Christians to love one another, to let that brotherly love amongst us continue. But he then says in verse 2, do not forget to entertain strangers, or don't forget to show hospitality to strangers. He says, by doing so, some have unwittingly entertained angels. And so we need to show hospitality. Now, sometimes we think hospitality means having folks over to our house. In this particular time period, in the first century, you didn't have, the Holiday Inn or the Motel 6 to check into. If you were going to travel someplace, you had to rely on somebody to accept you into their house, into their home, in order to have a place to stay. And so hospitality maybe meant something different, but it really means a love for strangers. Right? So let brotherly love, let the love of the brethren continue, but also have a love for those that are outside, have a love for strangers. Don't forget to have that. And so sometimes strangers, they need a little help. And if we're going to show love to them, sometimes we need to help them. Sometimes it can be a challenge to know whether we should help folks or not, especially in our day and age. Are there folks that are professional panhandlers in our day and age? Yeah, there are. And so sometimes it's a challenge to know whether to help them or not. Or what are you going to do with what it is that you give them? When I was in Colorado going to preacher training school, I was walking along the path in the park, and there were some folks as you were walking in the park, you'd come like across this underpass, and there were some folks that were begging there at the underpass. And as I was coming up the trail, I saw them, and somebody had given them something through the window of their car, and they immediately ran into the woods. And I'm thinking, well, there's got to be something wrong here that they ran into. And so I continued along my path back towards where our apartment was, and they were there in the woods, and there you could tell they were counting what they had to see how much they had. Right. And then the man stayed there, and the woman continued to run towards, there was a little set of stores that were there. And I thought, well, maybe they have some sort of medical emergency. Maybe she's running because she's trying to get help. She ran into the liquor store. And I'm thinking, is it that bad that you've got to run to the woods and count your money real fast and then run, actually run to the liquor store to get your fix? And so sometimes we may think, well, I don't want to enable their bad behavior, but we can do things rather than giving folks cash, right? We could go with them down to the gas station and use our credit card maybe and put some gas in their tank if that's what they need. We can take them to the grocery store and we can buy them some. We can take them to McDonald's and we can give them a meal. I knew some folks, they had these things, and for lack of a better term, they called them bum bags. But they had these bags that were made up ahead of time that had some snack crackers in them, and they had bottled water, and they had some tracts that were in there, and they had some certificates from McDonald's. Some people refuse those. When you drive up and you try to hand them that's not what they wanted. They wanted money, right? Because they wanted to. And sometimes they're honest. They say, no, I just want to buy beer and cigarettes, right? They just want the money. And unfortunately, that's the world that we live in. Do you think sometimes Jesus helped folks that didn't deserve it?
He helped us by dying.
He helped us by dying on the cross. Did we deserve that at the time? No, we were foreigners, right? We were enemies of Christ, it says in Romans chapter 5. So he helped folks that maybe didn't deserve it, right? He healed, was it 10 lepers? So how many of them came back? 1, right? So, yeah, sometimes he helped. So what about us, right? And so we need to think about that and how we look at strangers and maybe strangers that have a need or strangers that we can help. If you're limited in what you can do, right? Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 says to do good to all, right, as we have opportunity, but especially to those of the household of faith. And so if we're limited, we're going to probably help those that are in our Christian family first. But we are to do good to all men. We need to have a love of strangers. Now, we need to be careful with what we do with what the Lord has blessed us with, right? We need to be good stewards of what God has given us, and we need to not be wasteful with that. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, Paul says, "For when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat." So if you've got folks that are freeloaders that could actually are physically well and could be doing something, right? If anyone refuses to work it, we're not to just support freeloaders. But in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17, it says, whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? So if you see that somebody's got a need and you can supply that need or you can help with that need, somewhere between those two verses is where we need to be at with regards to benevolence. All right, but don't forget to entertain strangers. Too often we're probably selfish, and that's probably the reason why we don't help others, is sometimes because we're selfish. Sometimes we have a love of money. Maybe it's not our money. Maybe sometimes we have a love of the church's money too, and we don't want to spend that either. And so we need to be careful with that. He says we need to practice this love of strangers because he says some have entertained angels unaware. Abraham did this. He entertained angels and fed them and had them didn't know that they were angels at the time. Lot entertained angels, didn't know that they were angels at the time. Now, do you think that we interact with angels from time to time? Why would he say some have unwittingly entertained angels by showing a love of strangers if that was no longer possible? In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 14, he talks about the angels minister to those who inherit salvation. Who is it that inherits salvation? Us as Christians, right? They do something to minister to us. Now, there's not a lot of detail given as far as what do they do. They don't help us catch the fly ball in the outfield, right? That's not what they're here for. But there's something perhaps that they do to minister to us or to relay messages back and forth. The angels the word means messenger. And so possibly we interact with angels and we don't know it. We don't know that everybody we come in contact with, right, lives in a house and where they live, because there are billions of people on the planet, right? So it'd be hard to know whether our interaction with folks was an angel or not. We wouldn't know it if it happened, I don't believe. He says, remember those that are in bonds, or remember those that are prisoners, as if chained with them. Ministering to people in prison can be difficult. There's a lot of red tape. When I preached in North Carolina, we had a member whose son was incarcerated, and he was about 2.5 hours away from where we were. And I wanted to go visit him, and it took 7 months to get through all of the paperwork. And I went to visit him, and all I had was my Bible. That was the only thing I had in my hand was my Bible. And they looked at me like I was there to break everybody out, right? And if I was a minister and I wanted to go visit somebody in the prison system, I could go visit him once a week for an hour, and that was all that I was allowed. But if I was a friend of his, who maybe helped him get into the situation that he's in, I could go visit him 2 or 3 times a week. And that to me seemed like it was upside down, that you would think you'd want them to have a better influence than the guys that got them in trouble in the first place, as far as the amount of time that you're able to visit with them. But it was very difficult to do, but sometimes it's not a lot of fun. Sometimes you don't know whether they're just playing you because they may get some benefits in the prison system if they're studying, and they're showing good behavior, and so they may not be serious about it. Sometimes you have to try to discern that. Jesus says in Judgment Day, I was in prison and you visited me, or I was in prison and you didn't visit me. At this time, some of the brethren may be in prison for teaching and preaching the gospel, right? And so their reason for being in prison, may not be theft or murder or those things. But we need to think about those that are in prison. And there's some folks that do a really good prison ministry. But he's basically talking about how to live your Christianity, right? Show love for the brethren, have a love for strangers, visit the prisoners. In verse 4, he talks about honoring marriage. He says, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. God created sexual relationships, didn't he? I mean, he created that way of being able to procreate and continue to multiply and be fruitful, right? And when we see in the Old Testament, especially when God blessed them, he blessed them and told them to be fruitful and to multiply. God arranged for that, and he arranged for that to be within the bonds of marriage, with the proper exercise of that activity is in the bonds of marriage. And he says, in the bonds of marriage, marriage is honorable and the bed is undefiled, that is acceptable in the marriage relationship. But outside the marriage relationship, right, fornicators and adulterers, he says, God will judge. Fornicators, that's having sexual relations with people you're not married to, right? Neither one of you are married. And so fornication, there's a lot that's under that particular term. If that word for fornication is a broad term. It would include adultery, although he mentions adultery separately here, but it would include adultery. It would include things like homosexuality, anything that's illicit sexual activity kind of fits underneath that umbrella of fornication. Adulterers, right? Those that are having sex with people that are married to others. Or maybe you're married to someone else, right? And so God's going to make judgment on those. Those are not acceptable behaviors. And we need to stress that sometimes, because God talks about it, and we don't talk about it very often. We talk about homosexuality probably a lot more than we talk about adultery or fornication. But all of those things are condemned by God. And our young folks need to understand that to remain abstinent and to wait for marriage and to have the right kind of relationship is important, because that's what God wants. That's what God desires from us. And so there's some specific requirements of Christianity. There's some specific behaviors that God expects us to recognize are right behaviors, and some things that he expects us to recognize are wrong behaviors. And there's nothing that we can't be forgiven of, right? No matter what it is that we've done, we can always repent and seek God's forgiveness for that. And so he mentions these four things here in these first three verses. Any comments or questions through verse 3 of chapter 13, or verse 4?
Well, verse 3 and a little bit about verse 4. You think about the Apostle Paul, who was put in prison. And there were many Christians that were being imprisoned because of their faith. And I see the writer here saying, don't forget those folks.
Yeah.
They're holding to their faith. They're being imprisoned because of it. They're facing difficulties, persecution, hard times. And the last part of that verse, since you yourselves are in the body also, one writer is saying it can happen to you.
Yeah.
You could be the next person in prison. But don't forget that. Take care of those who are in prison. They have a need, go visit them, try to fulfill that need. And I think about the society of the time this was written. There was a lot of sexual immorality in society, much like today.
Mm-hmm.
You see it all throughout all the epistles that Paul would write, constant warning about adultery, fornication, sexual sins, and so forth. I see here, as he's closing this great letter, he's just touching on a few very pithy in way thoughts to remind you dealt with Christ and what he's done and even better and all that. So here's a few things I want to remind you about as the writing closes.
Yeah. He wants to remind him of all that. You're right. I mean, Paul was in prison. He wrote to Timothy. He said, "Don't be ashamed of my chains," right? Because you may think, all right, Timothy is a preacher. Well, I don't want to rock the boat too much, right? I don't want people to get angry because they might throw me in prison too. And Paul says, don't be ashamed of my chains. You might have to suffer as well. I think at the end of this book, it talks about how Timothy is going to be released. So Timothy had been arrested and put in prison at some point as well. So he may have taken, Paul's advice in 2 Timothy to not be ashamed of his chains. But yeah, we need to remember those, because they're there because they're preaching the truth, right? And we may reach a point in this country, hopefully not. Hopefully that's been averted for a while. But, certainly in Canada, there have been folks that have been in prison for preaching against homosexuality. And so they consider it to be hate speech. And so there may come a time where, we've got to make a choice if we're going to continue to preach the truth or if we're going to be scared. Don't be ashamed, Paul says, of his chains. And, remember those that are in prison, because they're part of the body also, right? They're part of and so don't ignore any part of the body if they're doing the work of the Lord. He says then in verse 5, I'm sorry, any other comments or questions? Good comments, brother. Thank you. Any other comments or questions to the first 4 verses there? In verse 5, he says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? He says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Right? Being content with what you have. Sometimes that can be a challenge, especially in our society, being content with what you have, because our society drives people to be ambitious, doesn't it? To always want more and to want more and want to strive to be the best, right? And want to strive to have, well, you deserve this, right? And whether it's the fine clothes, whether it's the hour and a half in the beauty parlor to get your hair, and I see some of these ladies playing girls basketball, and boy, their hair is perfect, and they got the false eyelashes on. I'm thinking, well, how much time did you're going out to play basketball? In a way, it reminds me of my brother. We were playing football in the backyard one time when we were during summer vacation, and I'm out in the backyard with the neighbors, and we're throwing the ball around, we're getting warmed up, and we're ready to go, and it's been a half an hour. My brother still isn't come out, and I go inside to find out what's going on. Well, he's brushing his teeth, he's combing his hair. I'm like, we're playing football, dude, get outside, come on, we're waiting on you. He's going to put a hat on anyways. I don't know what he's combing his hair for. But sometimes they want to look good, right? Because our society kind of drives that. And so we have kind of this thing that our society builds into us to a certain degree, that we want to have that next iPhone, right? Because, well, it's the new tech, and it does more, right? And it's got an extra little bell and whistle on it. I've got a Bible software program that they constantly revise it because they're putting new bells and whistles on it, and they want you to buy the next upgrade, right? And you got to have the new one because it does this extra little feature that it's got on it. And so we have this desire sometimes to want, the bigger house, the newer car, the thing that's got more bells and whistles on it. He says, let your conduct be without covetousness. You watch the programs on HGTV, people are looking for their first home, right? Young couple, they're looking for their first home. And there's just 2 of them. And they got to have a house that's got 3 or 4 bathrooms. And that always amazes me. It's like, there's 2 of you, but you need 4 bathrooms. How many of those can you use at once, right? I mean, isn't it just kind of one at a time? How many shoes can you wear? I know the Marcos had closets full of shoes. How many shoes can you wear? How many suits can one man? I got some suits that I can't fit in. I'm hoping to lose weight and get back into those. So I've got some extra suits, actually, that I don't use. But how many can you wear, right? Material possessions are to be things that we use. Those aren't to be the goal, right? We ought to use our material possessions to help people. Sometimes, though, in our society, and sometimes we get in the mindset of using people to gain more material goods. Well, whoever dies with the most toys still dies, right? And so we need to let our conduct be without covetousness, to not have a desire for all those things that we don't have, that we probably don't need. He said, be content with what you do have, right? Be disciplined in what you do have. It doesn't make any difference how much you make. If you can learn to live on 80% of what you make, no matter how much that is, if you can learn to live on 80% of what you make, give 10% to the Lord, put 10% away for a rainy day, you'll have it covered. God says, test me in this, in Malachi. If I'll not open the windows of heaven, if we give like we're supposed to, God's going to make sure that we have the things that we need. We're not going to go hungry, right? If you do that, you'll be wealthy. You'll never have a lack of anything if you can learn to live on 80% of what you make. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6, Paul tells Timothy that godliness with contentment is great gain. If you can do the right things, I think Brother Mark talked about godliness in 1 Timothy in our devotional lesson Wednesday night. Great devotional lesson on godliness, right? Doing what it is that God wants, having love from a pure heart, having a clear conscience, having a sincere faith, right? If we've got those things, if we're trying to be godly people, godliness with contentment is great gain, because you're going to be at peace with yourself. You're going to have a peace of mind that you don't get when you're chasing material things. Why? Because when you're chasing material things, you're never going to be satisfied. There's always going to be something newer. There's always going to be something better. There's always going to be something bigger. And so you're never going to be satisfied if you're chasing after material stuff. But godliness with contentment is a great gain because you get a peace of mind that comes from that, and you can relax. You can chill. Right? And so you don't have that anxiety, if you will. There's peace and freedom in that. That's the great gain that comes from godliness and contentment. And if you do his will, right, if you're doing what it is that God wants, if you're being a godly person, if your conduct is without covetousness and you're being a godly person, he himself has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. If we're doing what it is that God wants us to do, he's not going to abandon us. I think it talks about, who can pluck you out of God's hand? Well, nobody can, right? Nobody can pluck you out of God's hand. The only way that you can lose that is if you throw it away, is if you walk away, if you neglect such great salvation, right? We can neglect it. We can turn away from it. We can willfully sin after we've come to a knowledge of the truth. But God's not going to leave us. He's going to stay by our side. If we stay with him, he'll stay with us. And so he's never going to, that's a great comfort to us. We may be worried because, if I stick with God, if I do what God wants, well, then, the Jews are persecuting me, and down the road, the Romans are going to be persecuting them. They're going to be facing tough times. But God's not going to, you might be tempted to think, well, God's not on our side because we're facing all this hardship. No, God's not going to leave you. It would be a great comfort to us to know that God's there with us. He says, we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what can man do to me. Jacob and I have both talked about this particular point, right? Sometimes we're afraid of people. Sometimes we're afraid of mankind. Sometimes we're afraid, I don't want to go knock on that door because those people might get mad. They might yell at me. They may slam the door in my face. And sometimes we're afraid of what our coworkers are going to think or what our neighbors are going to think about us if we talk to them about God and Jesus. Sometimes we're afraid of people rather than being afraid of God. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, Jesus says, don't fear those who can just destroy the body, right? If you're afraid that they're going to kill you for your Christianity, don't be afraid of those who can just kill your body but can't do anything to your soul. Rather fear him who has control over both your body and your soul, right? He's going to determine where you're going to go for eternity. You ought to be more afraid of him than you are afraid of people. Because what's the worst that man can do to you? He can kill your physical body, right? That's the worst thing, which gets you to your reward that much faster. So why should you be afraid of that, right? What can man do to me? And so he quotes here from Psalm 118 and using another Old Testament passage to try to give them courage and understand that the Lord is with them in all of this. He says in verse 7, then, remember those who rule over you, who have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow, considering the outcome of their conduct. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Do not be carried about with various and strange doctrines, for it is good that the heart be established by grace, not with foods which have not profited those who have been occupied with them. We have an altar from which those who serve at the tabernacle have no right to eat. He says, remember those who rule over you. I think this is directed to them to think about their elders, but you may have folks that are leaders in the church that are not elders. I think it would apply to them as well. Remember those who rule over you, those who are leaders among you. The word that's used here is also applied to Paul and Barnabas over in Acts chapter 15 and verse 22. Talks about them being leaders amongst the people. And so they were not elders in the congregation. They were leaders in that congregation. They were leaders in what it was that they were doing. You've got the same word that's used in verse 17, where it says, obey those who rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls as those who must give account. Let them do so with joy, not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you. In verse 24, uses the same word, greet all those who rule over you and all the saints. So again, it seems like it applied to all leaders, but there's a special application here, I think, to elders as those who rule over you, those who are watching out for your souls, those who are going to have to give an answer for their watching out for your soul, those who lead you. And so here in verse 7, he says, remember those. And it's not just a one-time, oh yeah, I remember, brother so-and-so, or I remember, Abraham. If you want to look at those folks that are in chapter 11 as leaders in faith, right? It's a hall of fame of faith. Remember what they did. Remember what they went through. Remember the patience and the faith that they showed in God, and how that conduct, how did that work out for them? Right? God made promises to them. Did God keep his promises when they remained faithful? He did. Right? Sarah received strength to conceive because she considered him who promised to be faithful. Right? And so because they lived by their faith, it worked out for them, right? And so in order to be faithful, you need to remember these string of imperatives, right? To remember your leaders, to keep thinking about them, not just as a one-time thing, but as an ongoing. Remember your leaders and think about what their outcome was. Follow their faith, right? Paul said to be an example, or to be a follower of him, that he was an example, but to be a follower of Paul as Paul was a follower of Christ, right? So don't just blindly follow Paul, but follow Paul as Paul is following Christ, right? And so follow your leaders, keep them in mind, because they're showing you a good example of faithfulness. Sometimes we don't think about those that are ruling over us. Sometimes we may take those that are ruling over us as elders for granted. Sometimes elders don't get to rule with joy because all we're doing is bringing problems to them. You need to let them know how much you appreciate the work that they do, the sacrifices that they make, and that they've taken on that extra responsibility to watch out for us, to help us in our weaknesses. Any comments or questions through anything this morning, or snide remarks?
I was just, when you were talking about Canada homosexuality a while ago, something I learned not too long ago. My husband and son are in Kenya right now. And even though they're father and son, they can't stay in the same hotel room. Because apparently homosexuality is either against the law or frowned on over here.
Yeah, there's some places in the world where it's illegal. Yeah, it used to be illegal here, but
Yeah.
that a long time ago. No. All right. Well, thank you for your attention, for your comments.